Hello. A few weeks ago, I produced two videos, one of which was a top 15 of my favorite fantasy reads, and the other a top 15 for my favorite science fiction reads. And now I am here to continue the series with my 15 favorite Japanese manga with a huge asterisk. That asterisk being that I am not going to include stuff that is hyper popular. This is what I do for all of my recommendation videos. I don't think it's very useful for me to tell you to read the stuff that everyone else is telling you to read. And I think this is especially true in Western manga discussion. If you look at what Western manga fans were esteeming 20 years ago versus what they were esteeming today, it's not all that different. You see the same names pop up over and over again, most notably Berserk and One Piece. These are two highly popular, excellent, and very influential series, but because they are so popular and influential, discussion of these works can crowd out a lot of other excellent works as well. You see it very frequently with fantasy booktubers where they'll start talking about Berserk and or One Piece, and the influx of traffic that brings in will slowly turn the entire channel into just talking about those two manga over and over again. Like, I've literally seen it happen 6 times. So as a result, even though I love both of those series, I will not be talking about them. I will not be talking about, I don't know, Full Metal Alchemist or Chainsaw Man, or even stuff that I love to death like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I literally have every single volume of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure available in English in the other room. I've been in the trenches is what I'm saying. But now that it has cultivated over the years such a massive fan base, that allows me to guide your attention to more obscure works. However, the opposite caveat that I will have, I won't be talking about anything that is truly obscure with only 1 or 2 exceptions. I would say that at least 95% of all manga ever written has never been officially translated into English. A lot of manga, if they get translated at all, are not done by big publishers, but by fans who publish their translations for free online in this sort of legal gray space. I could make this top 15 list entirely of these hyper obscure works that will never have a chance of being officially published, but that won't be very useful to the average viewer. So I tried my very best to stick to stuff that was only officially available in English, again, with only 1 or 2 exceptions. If you're huge into manga fandom, you probably would have heard of many of these. But if you're not as familiar with this world, I hope that some of these recommendations will be illuminating to you. When manga gets published, it's usually in a magazine aimed at men, or a magazine aimed at women, or aimed at boys, or aimed at girls. So as a result, due to the very publishing logistics of that medium, there is a strong sense of this is stuff for men, this is stuff for women. That doesn't mean that there aren't titles that don't end up being these huge crossover hits. The side effect is that when a lot of people make these top 10 manga, top 20 manga, top 100 manga, it usually ends up dominated by works that are exclusively aimed towards men in their mid-20s. And long story short, even though I do fall into this pitfall a little bit because I am a dude and I am reading a lot of manga for dudes, I have also made sure to include some excellent manga that are written by women for women. One last note, our guest this episode will be my VHS tape for Tonari no Totoro, directed by Hayao Miyazaki. Number 15. The entire oeuvre of Ryoko Kui. Ryoko Kui has become really popular over the last few years for her long-running and recently completed manga, Delicious in Dungeon, or Dungeon Meshi in the original Japanese, which is an excellent D&D inspired story. Delicious in Dungeon, D&D, get it? About a party of adventurers who, due to adverse economic prospects, are forced to travel through a dungeon, not relying on traditional provisions, but literally eating all the monsters that they slay along the way, making omelets out of harpies' eggs, or trying to eat gelatinous ooze or whatever. By utilizing the culinary tropes that are commonly associated with cooking manga, Ryoko Kui is able to craft one of the most fun and dynamic fantasy stories that you have ever seen in print. I love Dungeon Meshi, but there is a very good reason that I didn't choose it, because I specifically want to point people towards her other works. Before she started serialization on that, she wrote a ton of one-shots and short stories that were collected into 3 volumes. Only one of them, The 7 Little Sons of the Dragon, is officially available in English. I read the other 2 through these fan translations. They are just some of the most interesting little stories. When looking at her bibliography as a whole, it's very clear that Ryoko Kui's strongest gift is for world building. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot as being synonymous with having magic systems and coming up with dates and places. But that's not what I mean at all. Ryoko Kui sincerely considers the different tropes that are associated with genre, but she doesn't take them as a given. She deconstructs them to say, how would this work in a real life scenario? And that's exactly what made Delicious in Dungeon so appealing for so many people. It is a fun and excellent read, but it's the fact that she truly thought through the logistics of what would it mean to be an adventurer in an economy that is based entirely around looting dungeons, right? And so similarly, in 7 Little Sons of the Dragon, she has short stories that are asking, like, what if mermaids were an endangered species that were protected by government fiat? Or what if you had mommy bloggers who are chronicling their experiences with raising their toddlers who are afflicted with lycanthropy? This is an excellent read, and the other 2 collections are even stronger than this. So I am hoping that with the recent anime of Delicious in Dungeon, that we are going to see the other 2 translated soon. I especially recommend Terrarium in Drawer. That is maybe some of the strongest stuff that she has ever written. She hasn't written anything in the last year. She has been taking a nice long break now that she has finished her 10-year serialization of Delicious in Dungeon, but I hope she takes this opportunity to write a couple more short story collections before she jumps into another long serialization. Number 14 is something that is not officially available in English, at least not in the United States. I am just going to grab a book off of my shelf to wave to the camera, even though it's unrelated. I guess the sacrifice will be the novelization of Catwoman. Number 14 is Blaster Knuckle by Shizuya Wazarai. I think that's his name. Blaster Knuckle is Berserk, but set in the Wild West. It's literally published in the same magazine as Berserk during that very first Black Swordsman arc, and it has a very similar art style and sense of action and violence. But what Blaster Knuckle is about, a black man named Victor Friedman, I think. Wait, what's the name of Huey's grandpa on the Boondocks? Is that... Wait. No. Is that the same name? Victor Friedman is a black cowboy with a shotgun gauntlet called the Blaster Knuckle, if you can guess, who goes around the South and the American West hunting down members of the KKK who happen to all be horrific flesh-eating demons in disguise by punching their heads off. These demonic KKK members ate my father, and so I am going to run up and punch every single one of their heads off. And it is a very satisfying thing to read. However, the downside is that once he punches their heads off, they turn back into humans. And so people are saying, why is this African American gentleman going around killing whites? Though I don't think that's the terminology they use, to put it politely. Even though this isn't available in English, I'm recommending it because obviously it's going to be something of great interest to an American audience. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen a radical uptick of historical horror and fantasy stories grappling with America's history of racism, specifically through people of color fighting against the abstract forces of racism literalized into demons or other monsters. You've seen this in Lovecraft Country, Ring Shout, and one of the best movies of this year, Sinners. This type of storytelling has become so prominent that it's almost cliche at this point, which is exactly why I find it so fascinating that it was seemingly pioneered by a Japanese dude over 30 years ago. He didn't have skin in the game with the history of American racism, but he still made a story about it because he just thought it would be awesome to see a dude going around punching off the heads of KKK members. It only ran for 3 volumes or so, but you know, it's still a delightful little read. Number 13, Monthly Girls Nozaki-Kun by Izumi Tsubaki. This is a romantic comedy. It's technically a yonkoma, which is the Japanese equivalent of a comic strip. So while in the United States, our newspaper comics have 3 panels, the format in Japan is 4 panels, yonkoma. So every single page has 4 panels that lead to a punchline. Monthly Girls Nozaki-Kun is a satire of shoujo, which is to say girly romance manga. The story is told from the POV of this girl who discovers through a botched romantic confession that the dude that she crushes on, this fellow high schooler, actually moonlights as a shoujo author. So in his off time, under a female pseudonym, he writes this girly romance manga called Let's Fall in Love. And in order to become closer to him, she decides to become his assistant in producing the manga. But this manga writer, the titular Nozaki, he's kind of autistic, I'm just gonna say it. So he understands all the tropes associated with this form of storytelling, but he has like basically no comprehension of how these sorts of human relationships work IRL. And soon we are introduced to all of their different friends and comrades, all of whom have different entanglements and romantic misunderstandings with each other. It's just such a fun, strongly character-based gag manga. I don't read a lot of romantic or comedy manga because they are so reliant on these awful stock tropes that get boring fast. But the characters in Nozaki-Kun are so human and fully realized that you're always rooting for them. I think a big key of it is that they all defy typical gender roles in very interesting ways. For the most part, all the pairings are heterosexual, but the women will have all these masculine traits and the dudes will have all these feminine traits that lead to very interesting cultural intersections and like absolutely rollicking punchlines. The main critique of this is that this story has been going for 15 years now, and no one is even close to getting together, right? This is a comic that happily puts any sort of romantic resolution on the back burner in favor of more jokes about how there is no romantic resolution. Number 12. Blood on the Tracks by Shuzo Oshimi. Shuzo Oshimi is the modern master of Japanese cringe horror. He is mostly known for writing Flowers of Evil, a work that I have not been able to read because it reminds me too much of high school in very bad ways. Shuzo Oshimi just loves subjecting readers to absolutely awful and devastating social dynamics that are so upsetting or so embarrassing that it's almost impossible to turn the page. While Flowers of Evil was about the interpersonal relationships between high schoolers, Blood on the Tracks is about family. Specifically, it is a manga about having a mother who is deeply, deeply mentally ill to the point where it ruins your entire life. Just the constant back and forth of absolute clinginess versus rejection and hatred rapidly turning on a dime, and the absolute horror of having the person who should be the most stable and loving person in your life instead ending up being a endless well of stress and horror and misery. True to the title, this work gets violent very fast. The mom in this is one of the most truly unhinged and upsetting characters in all of fiction. I think many people might have been exposed to this by Super Eyepatch Wolf's video essay where he's like, "Blood on the Tracks is the most disturbing manga I've ever read." Because that's what every Super Eyepatch Wolf video is. Season 7 of Riverdale is the most disturbing TV show I've ever seen. Old Chinese masters faking that they have superpowers and the ability to raise the dead is the most disturbing use of martial arts I've ever seen. I'm sorry, I've been working on that impression. For most of its serialization, Blood on the Tracks is high-grade schlock. It's like watching a 70s B-movie psychological thriller play out in real time. But the reason why I'm ultimately including it, as it began to wind down, it turned in a direction that was far more shocking than all of the murders or mayhem that had occurred up to that point. The conclusion ends up being so shockingly humanistic and empathetic that it transfigures itself into one of the most cathartic reads that I have ever come across. Number 11, Showa, A History of Japan by Shigeru Mizuki. Shigeru Mizuki is one of the grandmasters of mid-20th century manga. He was a contemporary of Osamu Tezuka, sort of represented an alternative path that manga could have gone down. Most modern manga is sort of done in the Tezuka style, you know, cute with really big eyes. While Mizuki's characters all have these big blobular heads and really tiny eyes. He is most known for the children's horror manga Gegege no Kitaro, but later in his career, he did more adult works, which culminated with this. This is only volume 1, but Showa is a chunky 4-volume history, both of Shigeru Mizuki's own life, as well as the entirety of the Showa period, which was the reign of Emperor Hirohito from the mid-20s all the way up to the late 80s. That's pre-war, that's World War II, that's the reconstruction of Japan all the way up till their financial success up in the late 80s. So all of the radical socio-cultural change that occurred in Japan in the 20th century happened during the reign of one man. I'm recommending this not only because it's a gripping read, it will inundate you in so much history of Japan and in the history of manga that it will help enrich and contextualize just about any other work of manga that you end up reading going forward. It's such a digestible way to catch up on recent Japanese history. My favorite cultural fact that I gleaned from this manga was about Michiko Hamamura, who had this one-hit wonder in the mid-60s covering Harry Belafonte's The Banana Boat song. She sang it in a relatively deep register for a woman. Day-o, day-o, daylight come and me wanna go home. Because these mid-20th century Japanese dudes had literally never heard a woman sing with a deep voice before, it broke their fucking minds. This is the sexiest thing we have ever heard. It is so sultry sultry. Anytime I read a manga from the 1960s or the 1970s, there will be a character who's like, this is the sexiest thing since Michiko Hamamura's cover of the Banana Boat song. That's just so funny. Number 10, Dragon Quest, The Adventure of Dai, written by Riku Sanjo, who Toku fans might know for eventually writing Kamen Rider Double, and the art by Koji Inada. I am a big fan of Dragon Quest, maybe Japan's most iconic video game series, even more so than Final Fantasy. This is a manga that was originally spun out of Dragon Quest III, which kind of single-handedly invented most of the tropes that we associate not just with Japanese RPGs, but with Japanese fantasy today. To be clear, this story has nothing to do with any of the games. You can just read it as its own thing. It just takes the spells and the classes and the monster types and whatever, and uses that as inspiration to tell its own story. And what is the story? Well, you have a kid named Dai. He goes on an adventure. There is a Dark Lord who wants to take over the dang world, and this Dark Lord has 6 evil generals. Dai is just a kid who has the potential to be the chosen one, and he teams up with some folks, and they go on an adventure to beat all these evil generals, and to beat the evil Dark Lord, and to save the land. Does that sound overly simple? Yes. And that is exactly why this is one of the best manga I have ever read. In the post-Star Wars era, people make a big to-do about the hero's journey, the farm boy who goes on the quest. In a world where we have hundreds or even thousands of stories that all focus to subvert the hero's journey in different ways, what makes The Adventure of Dai so fascinating is that it plays every single one of those tropes entirely straight. In doing so, it proves that tropes exist for a reason. Tropes exist because they are effective storytelling techniques. The Adventure of Dai reads like Dragon Ball in a high fantasy milieu, but with perfect pacing and perfect character arcs, because you can tell that it was efficiently planned from the start. Because it is so directly and efficiently told, all of these basic building blocks of shonen action storytelling that you would otherwise think as cliche or tiresome takes on this whole new appeal. There will be an arc where he's training to learn the secret technique of his mentor. When he finally pulls it off in the big fight with the big villain, you're like, oh! Later on, he learns he's part of a secret bloodline, and he has a bloodline technique that only he can use, and you're like, oh! Later on, he's like, what if I use my mentor's lost technique with my secret bloodline and combine them together for the most powerful attack ever? And you're like, oh! Long story short, this is literally the pinnacle of Naruto style storytelling. It just doesn't get more fun than this wonderful popcorn action. Number 9 is Bota Bota, or Drip Drip, by Paru Itagaki. Paru Itagaki is the daughter of Keisuke Itagaki, the author of the long-running and infamous fighting manga Baki, a comic about the absurd pinnacles of the male physique. All these hyper buff dudes walking around, beating the shit out of each other, not really for any real reason except dudes rocking. Paru in her own career has proven time and again that she is just as willing to be as uncompromising and absurd as her father is in her stylization. But while her father's work is toxic masculine, hers is toxic feminine. In a medium where a lot of women authors are sort of constrained by Japan's gender roles, Paru Itagaki is one of the only women manga authors that I've read who is fully willing and even shameless in depicting weird and off-putting relationship dynamics in an effort to explore the intricacies of mature female sexuality. Even in her breakout work, Beastars, which shows this Zootopia-like world of anthropomorphic animals living together in society, she is clearly utilizing the dynamics between herbivores and carnivores to examine, in some shockingly frank ways, the sexual dynamics between men and women. Drip Drip, which was her follow-up work, is an examination of what it is to be a woman with sexual desire in a culture that highly emphasizes purity. It's about a girl who is deeply neurotic about filth or uncleanliness, to the point where if she even touches a trash can, she gets these uncontrollable nosebleeds, just gushing blood everywhere. And unfortunately for her, this neurosis extends to any form of sexuality. Even though she is a romantic who wants to get married or even have a boyfriend or even hook up, if she gets into the slightest compromising situation, she just starts gushing blood from every orifice. And this is played for really dark comedy where she's just like trying to make out with dudes and her blood is just like spurting right into his mouth and they're always like freaking out and she's just like chasing after them, absolutely covered in blood and gore and viscera, like, love me, I just need someone to love me. Is that blood a direct metaphor for menstruation? Maybe, but it can also be a wider metaphor for what does uncompromised desire look like in a society where you're really supposed to tamp down on it. Number 8, Lone Wolf and Cub, written by Kazuo Koike and drawn by Goseki Kojima. This is easily the best samurai manga ever written. It's so influential, both in its original form as well as the grindhouse, super violent movies that they inspired throughout the 1970s. Even though Lone Wolf and Cub is now used to describe any dynamic where you have an older killer and a young child going on adventures, I don't think enough people actually read the original text, because if they did, they would realize that this is the sickest story ever written. Every single chapter, you're like, holy shit, this rules, oh my god. The premise is simple. Ogami Ito is an executioner for the feudal court. He has a wife, he has a son, they have lots of friends and family. However, due to political scheming by a rival clan, Ogami Ito is betrayed. Every single person he knows gets ruthlessly butchered except for his 1-year-old son. And so he swears revenge. The two of them are gonna go out and they are going to be Lone Wolf and Cub. They are going to roam the land, gathering allies and resources until they can get the bloody revenge that they crave. Kazuo Koike's writing is just so hard-boiled and so badass. Every time Ogami Ito says, "We are on the Meifumado, the path to hell. We will do anything to get revenge," you're like, oh my god, yeah. And Goseki Kojima's gritty, sketchy art is just so enrapturing, which leads to this manga's most enduring influence, which is the entire career of Frank Miller. Frank Miller, who in the 80s entirely reinvented Daredevil and Batman to become the cool fan favorite characters we know them as today, literally based his entire art style off of reading Lone Wolf and Cub. The man couldn't even read Japanese. He would literally just flip through the pages, observing the paneling, the choreography, the physical storytelling in each of Goseki Kojima's images was the art school he needed to reinvent superheroes as we know it. Even though I am building Lone Wolf and Cub as this gritty masterpiece of supreme samurai violence, the emotional through line is Daigoro, the son, the titular cub, this literal infant when the story starts off, who is maybe 5 or so by the time the story ends. Even though in the moment you're relishing like, hell yeah, go around cutting these dudes' spines. You're watching this child grow up surrounded by violence. And even though he is mostly nonverbal throughout the story, you can see that he is questioning and examining these horrible levels of violence. He is asking himself on the inside, is this revenge worth it? Is it worth us causing so much suffering? Why can't I be a normal child? I just want to play with a ball. I just want to go to a harvest festival. But instead, he is trapped in assisting with his father's frankly suicidal schemes. And that heartbreak is one of the many, many things that makes Lone Wolf and Cub such an addicting read. Number 7. I am holding up Buddha, but really I could say literally anything written by Osamu Tezuka. I'm choosing Buddha because it's maybe his most accessible work. It's the first one that I read. Over the last 10 years, I have read dozens, if not hundreds, of Tezuka stories. And except for like 2, they have all been absolutely superb. Osamu Tezuka, if you're not familiar with him, is literally the godfather of manga. He is the man who codified the entire medium back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And then up until his death in the late 80s, kept reiterating and refining the very form of comic storytelling until his tragic, relatively early death. He is most known for creating the character of Astro Boy. Frankly, that's kind of a shame because I feel like most Western manga readers don't really give him a fair shake because they think like, oh, he's the guy who did all that kitty stuff. Astro Boy and Jungle Emperor, also known as Kimba the White Lion. But Tezuka's genius is that he could write cutesy stuff for kids, he can write girls comics, he can write boys comics, and then he can also write the most mind-bending and fucked up stories you have ever read. I remember when I read his magnum opus, Phoenix, which I didn't choose for this because it's technically incomplete and it's really hard to find the volumes these days. But I remember reading the 4th arc of it, I think, and the plot turns were so shocking. I was reading it at a cashier job that I had at the time in between customers, and I remember just thinking like, is he allowed to do this? Is he allowed to have this happen? When you're trying to read his works in modern day Japan, they have fit everything he ever written in roughly 300 page volumes, which means that over the course of his 60 years, he wrote some 120,000 pages of manga. There are times where he was literally writing 10 different manga at the same time. That's how prolific he was. In comparison, One Piece, the go-to long manga, 20 to 25,000. So 1/5 of that corpus. I'll talk about Buddha specifically. This is his 8-volume biography of Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha. This is an epic in every sense of the word. Over the 400 pages of this first volume, you don't even get up to the birth of Siddhartha Gautama yet. Because Tezuka is laying so much track for all of these different interlocking characters and plot lines with ramifications that extend through generations. He didn't seem to really plan his stories ahead that much, which makes it even more astounding how effortlessly he can connect dozens of different plot lines together in these intriguing and ultimately deeply satisfying ways. Number 6, Otoyomegatari, otherwise known as The Bride's Story by Kaoru Mori. This is a historical romance manga set on the Asian steppes, which I think it's very easy to say like, oh, like Mongolia, right? But I don't think it's as clear cut as that. They never really explicitly identify many of the different tribes and peoples who are represented in this manga, but I think people who are versed in that field are able to tell based off of the different styles of dress and cultural practices by the diverse set of characters represented in this manga. For example, our protagonist, Amir, is a Kazakh girl. I think she's 19 or 20, who at the start of the comic marries into an Uzbek tribe as part of an alliance or something, but the only eligible bachelor they have to marry her to is a 12-year-old boy. That premise has potential to get sketchy real fast, but Kaoru Mori is adept at keeping the relationship between this central couple pretty sweet and platonic, as it uses Amir's introduction into this new tribe as a chance to explore what life is like on the steppe during the 19th century. As the story continues, it spirals out. We meet more tribes, we meet more heroines, and we get to explore their searches for romance, and that is used to build this complex ethnography of all of these different people groups that are basically ignored entirely in Western media. There is a meta plot about potential war between Russia and Great Britain as these different world powers seek to do their games of diplomacy using the people of the steppe as pawns, but that hasn't really come to a full conclusion yet. I would say that the story is maybe 3/4 or 4/5 done at this point, but unfortunately it comes out at a snail's pace. This has been running since 2008, but at the end of the day, every single chapter of this is a pleasure to read due to the sheer research and detail that Kaoru Mori brings to every single one of her images. Most notoriously in her depictions of textiles, she is clearly willing to spend hours and hours inking intricate patterns on these costumes, all in the aims of achieving the verisimilitude that it would require to suck you into this other world. I hope this comic inspires the next generation of manga artists to portray other underexplored realms and time periods with just as caring a level of detail as Kaoru Mori brings to all of her work. Number 5, Real by Takehiko Inoue. Takehiko Inoue is one of the few modern mangaka who has multiple generationally important manga under his belt, and his career is far from over. He made his name with the iconic sports manga Slam Dunk in the 1990s, which basically single-handedly popularized basketball in Japan. He is also highly esteemed, especially on these sorts of Western greatest manga of all time lists, for his Miyamoto Musashi biographical manga Vagabond, which is probably the single most definitive work of samurai literature of the 21st century so far. I don't think that's a controversial thing to assert. However, Real is better than Vagabond. Sorry. Throughout the 2000s and the early 2010s, Takehiko Inoue wrote Vagabond and Real simultaneously, with Vagabond being his main project and Real being on the perpetual back burner ever since he put Vagabond into indefinite hiatus in the mid-2010s. He has still been working on Real in the background, just one chapter every 3 months. A real molasses pace, comes out as quick as a snail, but he's still working on it and it is slowly moving along. But what is Real? Well, I'll put it simply. Real is arguably his spiritual follow-up to Slam Dunk, but instead of focusing on basketball, it focuses on the world of wheelchair basketball. Wheelchair basketball is a very interesting topic. In my millennial mind, I associate loud wheelchair representation as being very 1990s. You would have para-Olympians on the Wheaties box. There is this idea of like, yes, there are people in wheelchairs. They are a part of society and we need to show them as part of society. Even though in the last 10 to 20 years, Western culture has come very far in representing various forms of physical or mental disability. Ironically, it feels like you don't really see people in wheelchairs wheelchairs on television that much anymore. It feels like there was some sort of backlash to the amount of wheelchair tokenizing that there was in the 1990s. But fortunately, Reel exists and continues to exist to remind us that wheelchair users are still a very significant part of society. If you feel like the United States has problems in addressing accessibility, then that is nowhere as dire as how rough it is to be differently abled in Japan. You don't really associate Tokyo with wheelchair ramps, right? Reel is the story of three men, one of whom has been in a wheelchair for a long time due to a bone degenerative disease, one who has just been rendered paraplegic due to a car accident, and the third, a delinquent who isn't paraplegic at all, but due to his foolhardy behavior caused a girl he knew to become permanently hospitalized, and how his guilt and self-hatred and his desire to make amends brings him into the orbit of these other characters. It starts off as a basketball manga, right? Wow, how come this guy in a wheelchair is better at basketball than I am? I want to become his friend. But as it goes on, it becomes clear that this isn't any regular sports manga. Because as I kind of alluded to earlier in this section, Takehiko Inoue uses this manga to smuggle in discussions about disability and accessibility in all the different ways that people are otherized in Japan for not conforming to physical or social norms. He forces readers who might not otherwise consider these questions because maybe they don't know anyone personally who is in a wheelchair or needs to walk with crutches, etc., to become a lot more empathetic to the plight of disability and to marginalize people in society as a whole. This is a highly emotional dudes rock manga. This is a manga where you'll be crying tears of joy when a character has finally undergone enough physical therapy to be able to lift himself up to the toilet for the first time. It's coming out at a very slow pace, but maybe it'll finish up in the next 5 years or so. Who knows what Takehiko Inoue will do after that? Will he ever return to Vagabond? That remains to be seen. What I'm saying is now is the perfect time to pick up a copy and start experiencing this highly emotional journey for your very self. Number 4, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki. Everyone knows that Miyazaki is the GOAT of anime, but I think that he is actually very underrated as a manga author. Nausicaa is the only multi-volume work he ever did, and yet it is still effortlessly so much better than nearly any other manga that has ever been written. This is a very unusual size for a manga to be distributed. Normally you kind of have the smaller tankobon proportions, but that's because Miyazaki has this absolutely gorgeous, intricate cross-hatched art, which feels more in debt to the artistic traditions of Linclair European adventure comics than it does to conventional manga. They literally have to sell volumes this big in order to capture just how amazing the art is. The story behind this is interesting. I'm pretty sure that in 1982 or whatever, he went up to executives at the conglomerate Tokuma Shoten and he was like, hey, I want to make an anime film. You know, I've proved my bona fides with Lupin the Third, Cast of Cagliostro, etc., etc. I want to make an anime film with some of these top craft guys. And I'm pretty sure the suit said, you are very talented, but no, because all of the money in making anime is in doing adaptations. We can't allow you to produce a film based off of an unknown story and characters. And so Miyazaki's way of getting around it is he started writing this manga, and then after a few months he went to the executives and say like, look, I am writing a manga. You can buy this manga in magazines right now. Can I make a movie of my manga? And you know, they said okay. Executives are the stupidest people alive. So simultaneous to producing the movie with Topcraft before Studio Ghibli, was even founded, mind you. Miyazaki wrote and produced this manga semi-regularly. It ended up being 7 volumes in total, and it didn't complete until the mid-90s. While he was working on Castle in the Sky, Kiki's Delivery Service, My Neighbor Totoro, Porco Rosso, he was still writing the Nausicaa manga, which goes far above and beyond anything that is covered in the already excellent movie. Like, I think the movie is only the first volume and a half out of 7. He is able to expand the world, the plot, the characters to these absolutely magnificent heights that the movie is only able to lightly tease. We are in an age that prioritizes the notion of strong female characters, right? And for good reason. It's great to have women protagonists who are cool and capable and dynamic, but over the last 30 years, I think a very common criticism to that trademarked strong female character is that a lot of writers, when creating them, will just make men and then put boobs on them. This girl is so tough. She drinks beer and she swears a lot. But the thread that Miyazaki is able to thread with Nausicaa is that yes, she is an awesome action hero. Her greatest power isn't her strength, it's her empathy. Her capability to love and to understand people, even those who would do her wrong, is mind-boggling, right? Bodhisattva levels of compassion. Infinite capability for love is what makes her powerful. That is what makes her such a fascinating character. Number 3, Ryu. The strongest man on the face of the planet. You cannot find this in a store. This has never been officially translated. This is a Japanese volume that I flew to Tokyo to purchase. When I read it, it was so absolutely insane that I literally dropped everything to get a copy of it. I went to like 30 different bookstores, used and new, going up to the cashiers and asking in my broken Japanese, Sumimasen, manga o sugashite imasu. Taitoru wa Shijo Saikyo no Otoko Ryu to omoimasu. And they'd be like, so desu ne, so desu ne. And then they'd like rush and try to find a copy. And usually there wouldn't be a copy because this is a hyper obscure manga from the early 70s. But fortunately, at a single bookstore in Akihabara, they had this newly re-released edition. It was for the 45th anniversary or what have you. Why am I advertising this manga, which you can't purchase in English? Well, because I want more people to find out about it. This manga is the exact midpoint, stylistically and thematically, of Go Nagai's Devilman in the early 70s and Bronson's Fist of the North Star in the early 80s. It really bridges the gap in the history of hyper-violent action manga. Ryu, the strongest man on the face of the planet, tells the story of a dude named Ryu, if you can guess it. He wears this mask that his master forced him to wear that keeps his power in check. But nevertheless, even with this mask that limits his abilities, Ryu is the original One Punch Man. If he is fighting against someone and he lands a hit, their head explodes. No questions asked. They explode and brain matter and viscera goes absolutely everywhere. And so this is a story of people coming up to him and saying, hey, your power could be used for evil, so we must stop you. So all these dudes keep attacking him. And what choice does Ryu have but to act in self-defense? And so he keeps exploding people's heads, which of course leads to far more heat being brought upon him. Because they're like, holy shit, look at that guy who's exploding all these people's heads. We gotta defeat him. Even though this is such a short story, Ryu, the strongest man on the face of the planet, has the most ludicrous escalation of stakes that I have ever read. At the halfway point, Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus the Christ, shows up and he says, "Hey, Ryu, I have come down from heaven. I am starting my second coming early because I need to tell you that you are too powerful and someone needs to stop you." And it only gets more ludicrous from there. By golly, wow. Besides its ludicrous plot, I want to shout out Kaze Shinobu's art. He mostly got his start working in heavy metal and various French comic magazines. So he has this gorgeous thick line style that doesn't look like anything else. Like, his work is clearly more influenced by, say, Tibetan mandalas than Osamu Tezuka or what have you. As the story goes on, the art becomes more and more and more unhinged, leading to what might literally be my single favorite ending in all of fiction. Not like, oh, it's so satisfying, but the ending is so absolutely absurd and unhinged. I literally put my laptop down. I was like, what is going on? What did I just read? I had my head between my legs for for days. Oh, it's awesome, dude. You got to find a copy. Find a copy. See, this is the only one I'm outright telling you that you gotta go on the high seas for. You need to read it. You need to read this bad boy. Number 2, Blank Canvas, My So-Called Artist Journey by Akiko Higashimura. I finally got some josei representation in here. Josei being the fourth of the 4 major demographics of manga. You have shonen and shoujo, stuff for boys and girls, and then you have seinen, adult men, and then josei is stuff that is aimed at adult women. Josei manga is the most obscure in the West because, frankly, it is the manga that is hardest to make anime and action figures out of. So unfortunately, there is very little capitalist interest in porting over these stories, which mostly have, women talking about their relationships and their feelings. Blank Canvas is an autobiography by Akiko Higashimura, who is most famous for her iconic gender-bending cross-dressing manga Princess Jellyfish, but this is a story of how she became an artist. This starts off with Akiko Higashimura as a young kid who wants to be an artist. She wants to make manga. She is good enough at art, in the way that 8-year-olds are good at art, that she is encouraged to go further with her dreams. She lives in a somewhat rural area, and this leads to her signing up with the only art classes that are really available in this provincial town of hers, which is run by this crotchety old man who is really only known as the sensei, who is looking over these students of all of these different ages, skill levels, disciplines. He is basically the only art teacher in the entire town, and he is very strict. He's whacking people with a wooden stick saying that's terrible, do it again, do it again. So Blank Canvas is about her relationship with this man. Even though he is so hard on her, he's saying you're a terrible artist, you will never make it. It becomes clear over time that he really has this heart of gold and really does care for her. And then the second half of the manga is about Akiko going off to college, starting her professional career, and how that causes a rift with her teacher. He says, you could be one of the greatest painters ever. Why are you creating these manga that only require the smallest portions of your entire potential? I think Blank Canvas is insidiously relatable. I think anyone who reads it can relate to it in ways that cause emotional distress. Growing up, you have parents, grandparents, teachers, mentors who just think the world of you. They know from the bottom of your hearts that you can go so far. You can do so much with your infinite potential. You never reach the full heights that those mentors dreamed for you. And even though you might be fine with that, you carry this pit at the bottom of your heart, This is a beautiful and emotional read. It's pretty short too, only 5 volumes. I recommend you check out any josei manga you find translated because those are so few and far between. Number 1, Bokurono, or Hours, by Mohiro Kito. This might not be the single best manga ever made, but it is one of the most personal to me. This manga hit me so hard when I initially read it that it forever changed the way that I approach writing fiction. I remember back in the early 2010s, you would go onto TV tropes or what have you, and you would see Bokurono described as Neon Genesis Evangelion, but more depressing. But when I did finally read it, I found it affirming and even in its own twisted way, uplifting. Mohiro Kito made his name writing the edgelord Pokemon satire Narutaru, and Bokurono takes a similar deconstructive lens and applies it to mecha. Bokurono is the story of 15 kids or so. They're kind of in their middle teens. They know each other, but it's not a tight-knit friend group by any means. They come across a man who says, "Hey, do kids want to pilot a giant robot? Wouldn't that be so cool? Wouldn't that be nifty?" They agree. Pretty soon, the 15 of them find themselves in a giant robot who they named Zearth, the Earth. A reference to George Akiyama's The Moon. One of the kids is randomly assigned to pilot the robot, and then they see a giant monster who is attacking the big city. And so they are just given the objective, fight off that monster. Bokurono is infamous for having 2 huge twists, and they are both revealed almost immediately. So I am going to go ahead and tell you right now. It turns out that what these kids are fighting against are people from an alternate dimension in some sort of horrible tournament. Whoever loses one of these mecha fights gets their universe deleted. If you lose this battle, everyone on Earth and everyone in the entire universe will die instantaneously. In winning, you are causing the death of potentially billions, trillions, quadrillions of people in some alternate universe. And how do you live with that? The second twist, it becomes pretty quickly apparent that once you win a battle, the mech consumes the life force of the pilot. Even if you successfully win a battle and save the universe, you die. So this manga follows this group of teens who are trapped in this cruel, inescapable game, who are dying one by one in order to preserve everything that they know dear. And so the mecha fights are only a portion of the story. Each arc is focused on one of these kids as they are piloting the mech and flashing back to their entire life, what led them up to this point. What are their hopes, their dreams? What are their fears and traumas that are informing them in how they behave and how they fight? They ask themselves again and again, do I even want this? Do I even want it all to keep going on? When you look at what these teens have gone through, for the most part, it's pretty bleak. Basically, these arcs are their lives flashing before their eyes, as it's becoming increasingly clear that doing this giant robot battle is the last thing that they will ever see before having their soul annihilated. Am I happy with my life? Am I satisfied that I am going to die to save all of these people I know, some of whom I love, some of whom I hate? But this is a long time coming. The further it goes on into the manga sort of inadvertently becomes the myth of Sisyphus. Or maybe advertently. I don't know. I don't know Mohiro Kito's process. As there are fewer and fewer and fewer of these teens left, in the pressure cooker of stress that this story provides, they are able to reach a level of self-actualization and grow far beyond the people who they were even a few hours earlier. That is what makes Boku no such an important work for me. I am going to call it to a close. It is rainy outside. With this video, I only scratched the surface for manga that I like. If you want to hear me talk about other manga in the future as opposed to just fantasy literature, let me know. Even though I know I am opening myself up to the very same thing that I was poking fun at earlier, all fantasy booktubers becoming manga tubers over time. Oh well, who cares about my hypocrisy as long as it gets me the views? No, I'm kidding. Anyway, bye. I love you.